already stated, the Free Independent Press and some other groups, activists of course as well, are engaged in a social struggle to keep politics cognitively and physically accessible. Already we've also seen the forming of social groups like Free Independent Press and activists. And however, the technologists have been very absent from this social struggle as an explicit social group until now. But I believe that this cannot be upheld any longer, and that the technologists as a group should really engage in the social struggle to maintain the conditions for resistance. And I will explore this now when I will start to look at what it means if technology is being introduced in political actions. And I'm trying to phrase, this is really a research which I will do in the next 5 years in my habilitation, to try and look at political technologies, the entanglements of politics and technology. Find that very interesting. There is also talk has started on this in sociology of technology, history of technology, under the term of technologized politics, a little just over the past years. But I will try to focus more on the technologies because I'm a philosopher of technology, so that is my angle. And we'll understand these as the technologies of technologized politics. And the definition, which I have just causally stated now, will be that a political technology is a technology which is a substantial part of some political measure, and maybe standardization can be taken as an indicator for a certain technology being a substantial part. But I do agree that this is still cause, and one could argue whether a certain pencil of a specific type, which is being standardized for filling out form X, Y, Z, is in the same way substantial as a long-range nuclear missile is substantial for foreign politics. But that's still an open thing. But somewhat this is just a working definition, and the interesting question which can now be followed would be that whether the introduction of technologies actually alters political actions in any politically substantial sense. This is actually the question which I will ask myself for the next 5 years and try to go in there a little deeply. For now, I don't have really a very worked out concept. I just have a couple of ideas and this threefold dimensions, which I will just briefly present you now. Values, effectivity, exclusivity. Values in technology is a thing that the Chaos Computer Club notoriously denies. They always say that technologies are not evil, they're neutral. But in fact, I believe that technologies are never neutral. And I think one way of seeing this is that a very easy thing to approach by saying that a technology is always involved in some sort of action, some human action. We always do something with technologies. And when we do something, we have aims in our head. And when we have aims, then these aims rest on some needs and values. And needs, of course, can be reformulated as values. And as such, we find a systemic net of values and needs in every single technology by just what we be able to do with that and how it is being developed and produced. And you can see this easily in any sort of car. If you drive a Corvette Stingray, for instance, your ultimate need is not to come from A to B, because then you would probably buy a different car, but also to impress people and to show off how rich you are and how fast. So there's always a net of values and needs embodied in any technology, and even if comfort can be counted as a value, which seems to be very prevalent and current technological development. And one question which has much to do with my talk now, which I find intriguing, is whether one could try and develop a notion of a global web of values and needs and illustrate and contrast that with the global web of values and needs as they are realized by technologies. And just to give you an idea what that could be about is if you, for instance, just see how much money is being invested in the tiny little details which nobody needs in our gadgets, and you contrast that with the money which is being invested in the development of devices to clean water, which would be very substantially needed by quite a few people to actually survive, then you can see that there's a huge difference of actual values which should be pursued in technological development and which are quite asymmetric to the values which are being pursued by technological development. But that's just an idea for the future. Yeah, another thing is the effectivity of technology. Of course, what technology usually does is technology enhances certain actions, or technology enables certain actions, as in the case of flying. We wouldn't be able to fly without airplanes, so These are, of course, the standard things which technology do. They somewhat add something to our actions. And another point is also exclusivity of technology. That is, that technology of a certain step of development is only manageable by experts, and that it is, of course, only affordable by the rich or powerful, which applies in particular to greater technological compounds and stuff like that. And also the directions of development are, of course, given by those people rich and powerful enough to afford experts. And these are things which have to do with politics as well. And in which way can be seen now? We can discern some immediate dangers now if we see these effects of technology being carried over and embodied into politics, political actions. We can then see that political technologies are actually quite able to realize nasty values within political actions, and these are especially tricky when they're somewhat contradictory, as contradictory values, for instance, are control and freedom, or security and freedom, or profit and labor, because if you try to enhance the one thing, then you automatically seem to, I mean, it's not a necessity, but you seem to have to diminish the other things. So that's something which political technologies can do and which they can introduce into the political actions. Then another difficult thing they could do, of course, is that they could enhance or enable illegitimate political measures in this effectivity thing. And another thing would be that they could also be managed, owned, and developed by politically strongly biased people, which, of course, has been the case in the voting computer industry in the US, which has been determined by Diebold, which are strongly politically biased towards the Republicans. So this is just a brief outlook to just really state this very basic thing now, that we can say that all these things seem to point to the fact that political technologies can actually be a very substantial part of political action and can alter politics in some sense or another. So that would be a natural thing to assume, and we can now renew our demand, the demand I have stated on political actions, for the case of political technologies, that political technologies should be cognitively and physically accessible too. However, we now encounter immediate problems when we look at certain high-tech structures, when politics are actually being interspersed with high technologies. And I just want to highlight three basic structural components of high technologies. The first component is intelligence. We see intelligence, a strong increase in intelligence in our daily lives in many aspects. Another philosopher has termed this the logical malleability of technological devices, and which are being intelligent. And this has a twofold effect. The first effect is that it is, of course, handy for us to have devices which are able to think and to do things for us while we're away, or to interact with us. So it's quite a natural thing to develop ever more intelligence into ever more devices of our daily life. And the other effect is that our own intelligent processes, our cognitive processes, can be supported by intelligence, and thus ever more of our own intelligent processes are being technologized in a way. Like when I use this PowerPoint thing here, then that helps certain cognitive processes of mine to be visualized, and so thus I have outsourced a part of my intelligent processes into a technology. And these two effects really have the effect that intelligence is being embodied into ever more processes, daily procedures, our cognitive processes, daily life, ever more things that will be an unstoppable thing for the future. And the danger, of course, is that you never know whose intelligence actually is there in detail, because intelligence, of course, might invite foreign interests and agendas, and by this interspersion of intelligence with our daily lives, these foreign interests and agendas might just be introduced in a very subtle way. A second feature which has to do with intelligence, of course, is complexity. Complexity is insofar complicated as it makes high-tech structures or high technologies very hard to understand or to control for lay people, and sometimes also impossible to understand or control at all, which is to say that even experts will not be able to fully reconstruct what's happening in a computer down to the very last detail. Or this applies even more to the case of genetic engineering or to nanotechnology, where the basic fundamentals are not understood at all, and the complex interactions with the natural surroundings are not understood at all and cannot be controlled. And so that is a very difficult structural feature of high technology as well. And third and last difficult structure in high technology is virtuality as well, which is difficult in two respects. On the one hand, one difficulty is that your local branch of technology shares a universally accessible virtual space. When it is a communicative technology of some sort, then that means that you are accessible from the virtual space. Your local branch is accessible from the virtual space. And of course, we all know what the implications of this are as far as surveillance is concerned. And another feature of virtuality is that it also makes certain technical procedures partly unphysical, as you might not be able to physically directly interfere with somebody who's intercepting your communication because it's just happening entirely out of your bounds. And the same feature of unphysical virtuality somewhat also applies to technologies which are simply beyond our reach, such as satellites, surveillance satellites, or stuff like that. So if we now take into account these structures and we see what happens when high technology is being introduced into politics, then we can see that high political technologies can actually render political actions in very bad ways. They can make them biased by introducing foreign interests and foreign agendas into these politics. They can make them invisible because they can hide them in the complexity of the apparatus. They can make them unintelligible almost instantaneously because only experts will be able to reconstruct what actually is happening and who is interested in what and who is biased in which way. So that really becomes a very complicated thing in complex high technologies. And they can also render certain political actions entirely unphysical and physically very hard for us to access. And one example is the Vorratsdatenspeicherung. What's that in English, actually? Data retention, yeah. One very nice example is data retention, which is a process entirely unphysical to us because we have no direct possibility to interfere with that in any physical way. And now, if we now remind ourselves of the demand we have stated that politics should be cognitively and physically accessible, and that also political technologies should be cognitively and physically accessible, we can now see that the introduction of high technologies into politics renders them cognitively and physically inaccessible. And that, of course, is a very dangerous situation. And we can also discern two different types of inaccessibilities. One I want to term partial inaccessibility, as it applies only to lay people who are not experts in the technical fields and not able to reconstruct these things on their own without a certain degree of expertise. And another inaccessibility, which is even more dangerous, is full inaccessibility in cases where these technologies are even not accessible by experts anymore. So as a consequence, of course, we have to state that fully inaccessible technologies as really a worst case scenario of entirely uncontrollable and unintelligible technologies and or parts of political actions have to be avoided as deeply dystopian in politics at all costs. And actually dystopian literature for me is always a very good backdrop to analyze these things, because most dystopian scenarios are really concerned with technologies which have become inaccessible and which somewhat determine the political course of life. And one very early example, dystopian example, would be the automatic doomsday machine which the Russians have invented in Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, which is inaccessible then once it is initiated, and so on and so forth. So that is the demand which would apply to fully inaccessible technologies. But the thing which we have to be concerned with more narrowly in our daily basis will be partially inaccessible technologies, technologies which are not accessible to the lay public. Of course, they should be avoided too in political actions, but due to this feature of logical malleability, we will not be able to avoid them, and this will just simply happen. And what we have to do then in this case would be to recover the accessibility. And these are largely technical tasks, of course, to say that. To realize when a technology is fully inaccessible is a technical task and can only be done by somebody who knows technology and who knows what's happening and going on there. And also to recover accessibility is also a technical task, because you have to understand this and be able to translate it and to do something against it. And this path of how to do this, how to come to avoidance and restoration, is a concept which I'm trying to develop now, which many of you, of course, do already, but this is